Thank you, Jeff. It's very good to be here with you all today. Inside is just as good because we got a lot. I'm always happy to talk about wheat. So I'm a wheat breeder and geneticist at Michigan State. I've been there for about 12 years now. And so our program, we've developed varieties, right? Commercially available varieties and have for 50 to 60 years at MSU. But also another function, we evaluate all of the commercial varieties that are entering, also all of the genetics that are planted on growers' fields now or will be in the next few years, go through our testing programs. We have 7 locations across Michigan. We're looking at some of these genetics under intensive management. We're really pushing the yield ceiling with the genetics that we're seeing. We're also evaluating them for disease resistance. Now, the one disease that we evaluate every single year, and we get money from Congress because of voices from across the country from growers like you, is Fusarium head blight. I know we haven't seen a lot of it. I'm going to talk about it because that's something we need to keep on our radar, right? Like the issues we had like stripe rust, they pop up maybe once every decade, right? 2016 was quite a few years ago now. And so we really need to keep those diseases on our radar to make sure that we're keeping our yield potential high. And also that we're developing a very good product. In the global marketplace, quality determines whether or not someone's going to buy that grain, right? And so we're in a different kind of market class. So we're working with soft wheats, right? And so that's going to go into crackers and pastries. You go down to into Frankenmuth there, you get some good pastries. That's coming from soft wheat, right? From Michigan, and so we're talking about down to the upper Mississippi Delta for our market class. So they've been hammered down in the southern tier of states this year, in the southern soft wheat production region. And a lot of rainfall at harvest. Test weights are pretty abysmal down south, right? There's a lot of VOM in southern Illinois right now. So what I'm trying to communicate is that Michigan is set up to have the best wheat crop in terms of quality across the region, right? And I hope you guys take that to heart because 95% of the soft wheat, the wheat produced in the eastern United States, it's milled right here. It is milled right here. It is baked into the ag economy of Michigan and these other states. Right? So Michigan has 2 of the largest flour mills in the country. Right? It's pretty significant industry. 50% of that goes through King Milling over in Lowell, but it's substantial. So all of that flour is going to be made to order for all of the food companies that are propagating the middle of the supermarket. So basically anything in the middle of the supermarket that isn't bread is coming from soft wheat produced in Michigan here and across the region. So things that are important, we've heard a lot about test weight today. We haven't talked a lot about VOM. It might not be a big topic this year. Falling number could be an issue, right? With weather like this, we're not quite at physiological maturity, so we're not in the danger zone yet. But if you planted an earlier maturity variety, I like that discussion with Manny before about falling number, right? Late planted wheat will generate flour later, right? If you get that crop in mid-September, it's going to be flowering plus or minus Labor Day weekend normally. And if it's planted a little bit later, it's going to be flowering a little bit later. And that could lead to these differences in falling number, right? Because we're talking about things that are very specific to the timing of when those rainfalls are happening. So if you have a crop that is 3 days in maturity than the one across the road, which can happen with the genetics that we have available, what I'm trying to say is these genetics are they're going to be ready to harvest at different times, right? So they're all different. All these varieties. We have a great certified seed industry in the state of Michigan, and I want to encourage every grower in this room to plant multiple varieties on your farm. If you were going to make an investment, let's say you were investing $1 million, would you put it in one company? Would you invest that money into one single company? Now, would you invest the profitability of your farm in one variety? You know, maybe you've grown that same variety for 10 years. You know, they work on your farm, right? Basically, they might show up late on Mondays or whatever, but they still do a good job. So you trust that variety. But what I'm encouraging you to do is to buy a few extra units of seed. Load that drill up, make a few passes, right? We're not asking you to do research on your farm. Just try out a new product and see what could be a benefit, right? Because these varieties, they're all different in terms of in these areas that matter to your operation. Flowering date's a big one, right? Those varieties that flower early tend to finish early, right? So if you're growing Moonlight, that's a week earlier than Jupiter. That is going to be it's going to have a week shorter grain fill period, meaning it's going to flower earlier. And so if you want a double crop, those are the kinds of varieties that you should be looking at that are flowering a little bit earlier. That's important when it comes to your T3 fungicide timing, right? Back to Marty's slides, it's that T1 plus T3. It's pretty important, right? And so nailing that fungicide timing is critical. So it's important to spread those maturities out because you're essentially spreading your risk, right? Those varieties at flowering time, a variety that flowers earlier versus later, those are completely different environments when it comes to the pathogen pressures and the weather pressures that are present. And physiological maturity, that's where we're getting to. We just wrapped up at Mason, we just wrapped up sampling all the commercial varieties at physiological maturity. So ultimately we're going to have falling number reported in the August Michigan Farm News report. In the wheat variety trial report, we will have falling number available for you. And here's my mythbusters. They're rare among soft red winter wheat, but there are soft red winter wheats that do have low falling numbers. They will sprout. Cy 100, one of the most widely planted soft red winter wheats in the last 4 years, will sprout after 3 days of rainfall. You have to be careful, right? Our job is to flush out those varieties so that we can communicate that to both the seed companies and the growers. So it's time to be very serious about falling number with the genetics that we have and make that a consideration in your variety marketing and also your variety selection for the farms. Disease resistance, that's going to come up every single year. It's going to affect your profitability because it determines whether or not you need that 2T2 fungicide, right? We talk about T1 and T3 being profitable. T2 isn't always profitable, but if you have stripe rust pressure like we did this year, it's something that you need. But there is variety resistance, right? I would say about half the varieties in the eastern U.S. have resistance to stripe rust. Right? Not all of them. Most of them from the MSU program have that level of resistance, but it's not a disease that we see every single year. Right? Now, if we were in Pullman, Washington, yeah, we would get stripe rust pressure every single year, and our USDA scientists would be screening all these varieties because that's like scab for us in that part of the world. But we can identify those varieties that are more resistant. That's something we're going to start this fall is screening with stripe rust and with leaf rust in the greenhouse. I'm a rusty. I did all my training in rust, and so these are diseases we're familiar with, and there's a lot of genetic resistance to these diseases too. So these are problems that we can solve with genetics. Now, I'm glad Manny introduced the canopy architecture. We have some opportunities to align these specific attributes of these varieties with those production systems, right? Narrow row systems. There are varieties that have very upright flag leaves, right? They grow more vertically than laterally, right? And those lateral varieties are going to be filling out the rows a little bit more. So these are different attributes of these varieties that we can use them in specific management schemes here. Now, I brought up differences in flowering time. You know, these varieties here, we're seeing a 4-day difference in flowering between these varieties. So a variety that flowers early, maybe there's a rain event, right? That 4-day difference is going to determine, for different varieties, one flowering earlier could be affected by scab. That leaves your other variety having experienced a different set of weather patterns in those 4 days may be unaffected, right? This is how we're spreading risk just by having differences in maturity. It also spreads your workload out, right? Maybe it's hard to cover 700-800 acres in a day with a spread. That's not what I do professionally, but logistics are important, right? You can spread your work out over that same time frame, so you don't have to get all your acres in that one day. It also comes into play for harvest, right? Physiological maturity. Those varieties that are flowering earlier are generally going to finish earlier, so you can spread your harvest workload out a little bit. Furthermore, those varieties that may be affected by a rainfall, they've hit physiological maturity a little bit. So there's an after ripening period where that grain is drying down, right? And so 5 days after physiological maturity was when the peduncle, it's a bizarre word, but it's what connects the spike to the rest of the plant. When that goes from green to yellow, that's the trigger of physiological maturity. I don't have good pictures of that, but you've seen it, right? And so those varieties are going to be, different varieties will reach that physiological maturity differently, especially those that are earlier. They're going to reach physiological maturity and they're going to be ready to combine earlier. So that's another rationale for splitting those genetics. Ultimately, they do synchronize though, by mid-July. They will synchronize later in the season. Now, for scab, you can see that genetic resistance plays a huge role. On the left, you can see a scabby field. This is just genetic resistance, right? Genetic resistance is the single most important factor in controlling scab. combining that with a T3 fungicide, that is your best policy for controlling scab, right? And I can say that 27% of all the experimental lines, 27% have the FHB1 gene in the germplasm, the genetics that we are able to grow in Michigan, right? And so what that's telling me is that it's a focus in breeding programs and for seed companies who are marketing these varieties. So it's out there. So there's no reason to settle for a scab susceptible variety and cross your fingers, because a super susceptible scab variety plus a T3 fungicide is not the best policy. The genetic resistance, a moderately resistant variety with a fungicide applied at the right time, is the best policy for controlling scab. So what does that even look like? So I'll rush through this a little bit. But you can see we take into consideration, what this is I'm trying to get you some background on the data that we report every year. And so we're reporting on visual responses. The most susceptible varieties, incidence, what percentage of the heads in this plot are affected? Quite a few, 80%, 50 or 40, right? You can see the lower incidence of infection. It's gonna lead to overall lower DON levels, right? And these are all just correlated with DON. They're not actual DON, but they're good indicators of how much mycotoxin is in there. And so you can see that some of these are for severity. That's how much that disease has spread within the wheat spike. It can infect initially, but then it's going to move, right? The most resistant varieties, it's not going to move beyond that one spikelet. There'll still be infected spikelets, right? But this is where if there's a breakthrough infection. So when you apply a fungicide, you're basically reducing the incidence. You're reducing the number of initial infection events. But then when you couple that with type 2 resistance, genetic resistance, that's going to inhibit the movement of that fungus within the spike. So it's going to localize it. It's not going to move. There might be one localized infection, but it doesn't move throughout the spike. Therefore, it doesn't produce more mycotoxin. Now we couple that together so you can differentiate these highly susceptible varieties with an FHB index of 52% versus a resistant variety at 5%, right? So we have, this is one of the means we use to communicate those levels of resistance versus susceptibility in these varieties. Now another disease, stripe rust, big topic of conversation this year. And so with the great greenhouse facilities that we have at MSU, which are getting even better with some investment from the state of Michigan, we are able to, we work with these pathogens in the greenhouse. And so our breeding populations here, we've got we move everything through the greenhouse in these pots. We move big populations through the greenhouse in a small space. At every generation, we are screening these. So you can see these leaves that are covered in leaf rust, and you can see some that are perfectly clean. All we have to do is pop those heads off of there, and we don't end up with those in the field. So all the material that we are moving forward with now, before it even goes to the field, we know it has a pretty good probability of being resistant to these pathogens, right? So with leaf rust, and we just got our stripe rust dialed in, but you can see the stripes forming here, and this is what some of that adult plant resistance looks like. You can see a few pustules. It's not always 100%, but it reduces the total amount of inoculum that's blowing in the wind, and also how much infection there is on that one individual plant. So the most resistant varieties, even with the fungicide, that genetic resistance is going to improve your overall yield. So it's something to look for, something we're going to be screening for in the future in the greenhouse. So I want to shift gears and talk about one of the products that we've developed. So MI20R12, this was derived in 2020. This is a soft red winter wheat that we've developed. And it's a Jupiter by VA11W-106. Doesn't mean a lot. It's a sibling of Hilliard, if you know that variety. So we got our rust resistance and some scab resistance from this parent. And Jupiter has very high yield potential, very good drought tolerance too. If you grew Jupiter last year, you'll notice it had very good yield potential still without much rainfall, right? And one of the secrets that Jupiter has is it's got a very low canopy temperature. So when we were looking at canopy architecture, those canopies that fill out more, it's basically evaporative cooling, like a greenhouse, right? So as it's moving that plant material into the space between the rows, it's more effectively cooling that canopy. So some varieties cool the canopies a little bit better. So that's one area where Jupiter stands out, and one area where R12 stands out as well. Very high yield potential, over dozens of locations over its 3-year period. It's doing pretty well. We've gotten data in from Kentucky, Southern Illinois, so it's still performing well. This year, test weight is very, very high. Now, compared to Cy 100, right, that you can see a dip in test weight. Generally, the Pioneer material has high test weight. 25R64 doesn't this year, but R40 has consistently high test weight. So does R12. So the reason I point out test weight is that you have to start with a high test weight. If you don't want to get docked, you have to start with a high test weight. And so, you know, anywhere from that 58 to 61 pound test weight, if you start with a 61 pound test weight, and there are a lot of varieties, and it's very consistent, right? If you select a variety that has a really high test weight, you will get a high test weight in the combine, right? Now, what's going to bring that test weight down? Rainfall. If you be ambitious at harvest is my message to you. Be very ambitious. Be aggressive, and if you have a wheat crop that's at 15% in 3 days of rain, you still have a chance for a 60-pound test weight. 3 days later, 57-pound test weight. You will lose a pound a day of test weight when that wheat gets rained on. So you have to make a very calculated decision. Do I cut at 15 and have a high quality, very marketable product? Or do I wait? Do I want to save a little bit on the drying cost? But there's a trade, right? You may hit 12%, you might, but you also lose test weight. You also could drop in falling number. Are those risks worth it, right? Or I'm encouraging you to cut at the higher moisture. I know you white wheat growers. I'm preaching to the choir on this, right? And there's some mills that will be taking that grain at 18%, right? They will take it because that's how important quality is to our milling industry. That's why they buy that wheat at 18% and will dry it for you, right? So, but that doesn't persist through the season, and not all sites will cut that deal. But there is an opportunity to maintain really high test weight, really high marketability with early harvest of our wheat crop. So that was my major public service announcement for this talk here, is to cut early. Be ambitious and cut early. Height, pretty good straw producer on this line. R40 is always a little bit short. Flowering, here's the distribution and flowering date, but we've got a long grain fill. So my point, there are some soft reds that will sprout. That is a soft white level of sprouting after 3 days. So we want to push that. So Don's pretty good scab resistance, good rust resistance. Now I want to get at some of what is potentially being released this year. So R12 came out last year. It's just across the board. All to scab, moderately resistant to stripe rust, very resistant to stripe rust, very resistant to leaf rust. That's LR18. This has got the a 4A gene from the Virginia Tech material. Just a gold mine of traits. Leaf spots. We don't talk much about them because you control a lot of them with the T1 fungicide, right? But we still need a clean canopy, and it's not always the case for the commercially available lines. So R12, we got some others that are doing well. These two lines are sib lines, or half sibs anyway. KWS 95 is the half sib, but they've got FHB1. They're holding up to our local stripe rust races, but these things are different across the country, and so there are some races that will knock down different strains of the stripe rust pathogen will knock down the resistance. So they're not resistant everywhere, but in our greenhouse they are. Now R210, this has been, I love this line. It's really short stature, really heads per square meter is this line's trait, very high tillering, very good yield stability, resistant to stripe rust. It does get a little bit of leaf rust, but it's very resistant to leaf spot. Now 20R96, this is super resistant to scab. It didn't do well last year, but because there wasn't a lot of rainfall, right? And in trials where the average of the trial is above 100 bushels, this line is always at the top. It's got very upright leaves. All the leaves, including the flag leaves, are very vertical tiller angle. So we have identified these genetics that should be ideal for those more narrow row planting systems. Now, it doesn't always happen that the more upright plant architectures do well on the narrow rows. However, narrow rows are always higher yielding. In the last 30 years, even in some of the first row spacing studies were done in the 1940s in the Dakotas, even then the narrow rows always yielded higher. Now, I don't know why we don't have 5-inch drills. There are some 6-inch drills available. Great Plains manufactures a 6-inch drill. The Case made a lot of 6-inch drills in the 1990s. So those tools are out there, but they're just not mainstream, right? In the end, most of the growers are 7.5-inch rows. There's a very small minority of 5-inch rows, but the majority are this 7.5-inch system. So I don't think we should be constrained by that kind of technology that we have. We should be able to grow the wheat how it's meant to be grown, and that's high yielding. And we do have white wheat coming out this year. Across the board, resistant, super biomass, just a beautiful line. I can't wait for yield data on that one. So I'm going to wrap up there. I meant to have this more of a discussion, but any questions or comments on what we've discussed here? I know I'm standing between you guys and lunch, so we're going to keep it brief. Yes? It does not. I'm not very creative, so we just keep it the number. But that allows the licensee to put their name and their brand on it. Then, yeah, yep. So that line, we got a grant from the state of Michigan to produce large breeder seed lots, and so I want to emphasize that we can go from a cross to 150 bags of breeder seed in 8 years. The normal timeline is 12 to 14 for that, especially to get to that scale. So we're scaled up. So we are 1 year of foundation seed away from certified seed sales for that variety. Any other comments, questions? Very good. Thank you all. Good to see you. Thank you.